Good day, everyone. Welcome to this video lecture on Mackie's Evil and Omnipotence. This is going to be a synthesis on Module 4, on the first part of our Module 4, and the problem of evil. And so as we already know, there are two parts of Module 4, that is on Mackie's Evil and Omnipotence, and the second part is Paul Ricoeur's take on evil. I will be presenting also the video lecture on Paul Ricoeur's Evil, Challenge to Philosophy and Theology. So for this part, I will be presenting again the summary of Mackie's Evil and Omnipotence. And so I have not prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but what I will do here is, of course, I summarized the paper, the work, the article of Mackie, and then I wrote, some of my thoughts here. So what I will do is read the paper and then do some side discussions if necessary. And yeah, before I proceed with the presentation, we have to take note that Mackie's take in this article is not, or Mackie's intention is not to show that there is no God, or indeed there is God. Whether Mackie is an atheist or not is not an issue here. The main intention of the paper, as I see it, is that Mackie tried to argue, that the arguments for the existence of God is irrational or is not tenable. And so that's the main thrust of the paper. So he just wanted to show that those arguments for God's existence are not tenable, are irrational, nothing less, nothing more. So towards the end of the paper, we will know that after presenting, after debunking those arguments, Mackie concludes that, look, the arguments for the existence of God are indeed irrational. He did not offer any solution or any position saying that, you see, at the end of the day, there is no God or there is God. So that should be the guide in understanding the work. So let me start. Again, I will read the paper and do some side discussions if necessary. So first of all, let me provide the context of Mackie's take on evil, so we will be able to follow the trajectory of his arguments and fully make sense of the main purpose of the paper. It must be noted that the question about the existence of God remains to be one of the recurring topics in philosophical discussions and debates. And in the debate about the existence of God, there are always two opposing camps. We know that too well. On the one hand, there are those who argue for the existence of God. And on the other hand, there are those who argue that God does not exist. So we have normally the opposing camps between the theists or the believers and the atheists or the believers. And each of these offered arguments as to their position, whether God exists or not. But as we can see, as I already mentioned, Mackie argues that those who argue for the existence of God miss to provide enough evidence to convince everyone that God really exists. And so this, again, the main trajectory of the paper. Mackie would like to show that all those arguments presented for the existence of God are irrational. In fact, as Mackie argues, all the arguments for God's existence that philosophers in the past had made were faulty. However, Mackie was quick to note that this position should not be used as reason for someone not to believe in God. So again, Mackie is not presenting any atheist position or argument as to the existence of God. Okay, so again, Mackie did not say that, look, because these arguments are irrational or faulty, therefore there is no need to believe in God. To reiterate over and over again, the main intention of the article, the main intention of Mackie in the article is to show that the arguments doesn't hold, or the arguments don't hold water. Nothing less, nothing more. And so, however, Mackie was quick to note again that this position should not be used as a reason for someone not to believe in God. Again, it's just that for Mackie, this argument is irrational. And for Mackie, those who argue for the non-existence of God have not been successful in persuading the believers, no matter how they tried. Um, so Mackie says that, look, the arguments for the existence of God don't hold water, are faulty, are irrational. But on the other hand, the atheists or those who don't believe in God also were not able to provide a convincing arguments that God really does not exist. Okay, so this is where Mackie comes in. And so in his seminal essay titled Evil and Omnipotence, Mackie attempts to prove that the belief in a good God is irrational, is faulty, is illogical. And Mackie uses the existence of evil as a proof to it. This is because the existence of evil as a direct opposite of good will discount the existence of a good God. So as I will show later, there are several arguments as to for the existence of God. And most of these arguments are banking on the idea of evil. And Mackie zeroes in on the notion of evil. And for Mackie, because of the existence of evil, the position or the arguments that a good God, all-powerful, absolutely good being is not possible. So as we can see, Mackie's main argument is that if an all good God exists, if an all-powerful God, omnipotence, all goods, God exists, then why the existence of so much evil in the world? So this the primary question that's Mackie would like to emphasize here, because the arguments of the believers, of the theists, is that, of course, God is omnipotent, all-powerful. He is all good God, absolutely good. But again, the argument of Mackie is the existence of evil will discredit this claim that God is omnipotent, all-powerful. So Mackie believes that the existence of evil is a direct contradiction of God being absolutely good, as Mackie writes, and I quote, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So these propositions are seemingly contradictory to each other. There seems to be some contradiction between this proposition, between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. Because the argument again is, because this is in categorical logic, this is a categorical argument. We have the proposition God is absolutely good, or God is omnipotent, or God is all powerful, and then God is good, absolutely good, and yet evil exists. So let me continue. But at the same time, according to Mackie, all three are essential parts of most theological positions. The theologian, it seems, at once must adhere and cannot consistently adhere to all three. So we will show later in the arguments later, Mackie shows that these three propositions are contradictory, and so therefore we cannot make use of those arguments to prove the existence of God. And then Mackie adds, however, the contradiction does not arise immediately. So to show it, we need to show the contradiction between and among these three propositions, according to Mackie. We need some additional premises, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. These additional principles are that good is opposed to evil in such a way that the good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. From this, it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and then the proposition that the good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. What Mackie tries to say here is this. Again, the main intention, just to reiterate so that you will be guided accordingly, the main intention of Mackie is to show that all the arguments for the existence of God are irrational, are faulty. And we have the premise from the very beginning, the propositions, God is absolutely good and God is omnipotent or all powerful, and yet evil exists. So through an analysis, or if we analyze those propositions, then we can really conclude that they are contradictories, and so therefore we cannot use them as arguments for God's existence. But what Mackie says in this paragraph, in this quotation, is that Mackie says, look, this contradiction is not directly visible, especially from the vantage points of an uncritical mind. And so that is why in this paper, Mackie would like to articulate or lay down or explore this argument so that Mackie will be able to help us conclude or identify at the end of the day that those arguments are indeed irrational. So again, that's what we will do here. So Mackie then claims that the propositions, God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and evil exists, cannot be all true, because again, they're contradictory to each other. In fact, Mackie added two more principles which make the three propositions logically contradictory, namely, first, if something is wholly good, it always eliminates as much evil as it can. That's the first principle that we can glean or we can draw from those three propositions. So if we claim that God is indeed good, absolutely good, then the existence of evil is not possible. And number two, if something is omnipotent, all powerful, then according to Mackie, it can do anything. There is no limit to this being. There is no privation, because this being is perfect, because it is omnipotent, all powerful. And so we can anticipate the arguments of Mackie here, which says that, look, God is omnipotent. We claim that he is omnipotent, that he is all-powerful. And so therefore, as an all-powerful being, he can do anything he wishes to do, including not allowing evil to exist. I hope that's clear at this point. And Mackie was convinced that these two principles, which are clear definitions of the concept of good, evil, and omnipotence, appear to be reasonable, and that most believers would agree with them. It's too obvious. Okay? And so maybe Mackie is trying, maybe one of the things that Mackie would like to say here is, look, these propositions are quite obvious. As an omnipotent being, all-powerful being, then he can, bar, or he can not allow evil to exist. Okay? And if he is a good God, of course, he will not let people suffer and experience all these evil things. That's quite obvious. But people do not notice that. Or especially the believers do not notice that. They just accept what is being told to them. Now, Mackie shows that the three propositions and the two added principles, we have now 5 propositions, do imply a contradiction, and that at least one of them must be false. Just think of this. God is absolutely good, and yet evil exists. So at least one of these propositions must be false, or at least one of these 5 propositions must be false. But with the emphasis on that proposition, if we have claimed that God is absolutely good, then there is no evil. Or if evil exists, then it should discount the fact that good exists. So they are contradictory indeed. Mackie then engages the responses to this problem, and in doing so, he distinguishes 2 major types of solutions, namely adequate solutions and fallacious solutions. So this is now at the heart of Mackie's paper, or Mackie's article on evil and omnipotence. Allow me to explain this in full now. To the first, Mackie agrees that the problem for the theist or the believers can be solved by giving up one of the 3 propositions. That is, for example, deny that God is omnipotent or good, or deny that there is evil in the world. So what Mackie is trying to say is that contradiction regarding the existence of God can be easily addressed or solved if we just drop one of the propositions there. And what he's trying to say here is, if we deny that God is absolutely good or all powerful, then there's no question or there's no problem. There's evil. And there's no contradiction with that proposition. Or we can drop the statements that evil exists. And so if we deny that evil exists, then there's no problem with the proposition that God is absolutely good or God is absolutely powerful. As Mackie writes, and I quote, "Now once the problem is fully stated, it is clear that it can be solved, again, by dropping at least one of the statements, in the sense that the problem will not arise if one gives up at least one of the propositions that constitute it. If you are prepared to say that God is not wholly good, according to Mackie, or not quite omnipotent, or that evil does not exist, or that good is not opposed to the kind of evil that exists, or that there are limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, then the problem of evil will not arise for you." So in other words, there is no problem with evil if we drop at least one of the propositions. Please remember that the title of the article of Mackie's paper is Evil and Omnipotence. And so the discussion will center on the concept of evil here. And I already explained many times already the main intention of the paper. So please be guided with that so that you can follow my discussion thoroughly. However, Mackie thinks that most believers will be unwilling to take this approach. They're not willing to give up. The theists, the believers are not willing to give up at least one of the propositions. Of course, obviously, because they believe that God is absolutely good, but at the same time, they can't deny that there is evil in this world, that there is suffering, that there is pain, that people, that there is violence, that there is injustice, that there is physical limitations like blindness and being handicapped and things like that. So people, according to Mackie, especially the believers, are not willing to let go of their convictions, their beliefs. For doing so leaves them with a conception of a God that is not worthy of worship, and therefore not religiously significant. Hence, although these solutions are adequate, according to Mackie, they are not really successful. Dropping at least one of the propositions could be an adequate solution, but that will not work, given that people or the believers are not willing to drop at least one of those propositions. Okay? To the second, Mackie then proceeds with the examination of the so-called solutions to this problem, which purport to remove the contradictions or the contradiction without abandoning any of its constituent propositions. In other words, for Mackie, these solutions remain to be unsuccessful as they are in themselves fallacious or illogical or irrational. So what I will discuss now are the fallacious solutions. So what just very briefly, what I just have presented is the adequate solution to the problem, as you can see in the above. Okay, Mackie also distinguishes two major types of solutions, the adequate one and the fallacious one. And what I just discussed here is the adequate solution. Mackie says it would have been adequate had the believers drop at least one of the propositions, that is, denying that evil exists or denying that God is good. And the second one is the fallacious arguments. And here Mackie engages thoroughly the fallacious arguments and show that indeed the proofs that the believers of God offered are illogical, are irrational. So let me now engage each solution from the vantage points or under the fallacious solution. Let me start with the first one. The first solution reads, according to Mackie, okay, the first solution under the fallacious solution as a whole, it reads, good cannot exist without evil, or evil is necessary as a counterpart to good. So we have that beliefs, as believers, we always argue that, yeah, God is absolutely good, and yet we experience evil. We admit, not just admit, we are convinced that God is absolutely good, that God is all powerful, but at the same time, we also entertain the idea that there are limited beings, that there are finite beings, that there are beings that are imperfect beings, that we also accept the fact that there are sufferings in the world, there are injustices, forms of violence, and things like that, despite the existence of an absolutely good, merciful, all-powerful, kind God. So we seem to argue that the two can go hand in hand. Thus we say, good cannot exist without evil, because we juxtapose the idea of evil to an absolutely good God. The idea here is that God could not have made a world which had any good without allowing some evil, since it is impossible for goodness to exist without evil. Okay, so it's impossible for good to exist without evil. Sometimes we argue that we cannot appreciate light without darkness. And so, but Mackie argues that this argument is indeed a limitation on God's omnipotence. Yeah? And so here in this first solution, Mackie is saying this solution, this argument is untenable, because look, if we say that evil is necessary for good to exist, Mackie is saying that puts a limit to an absolutely good and all-powerful God, because being an all-powerful God, he can do anything. And so why not block that evil from happening? In fact, he can do that as an absolutely powerful God, as an omnipotent being. Mackie says that this, and I quote, this sets a limit to what God can do, saying that God cannot create good without simultaneously creating evil. And this means either that God is not omnipotent, or that there are some limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. At the end of the day, that is still a contradictory claim, and it cannot hold water. And now Mackie writes, it may be replied that these limits are always presupposed, that omnipotence has never meant the power to do what is logically impossible. And on the present view, the existence of good without evil would be a logical impossibility. That's untenable. That's impossible. That the existence of the main contention of the proposition is not tenable. It's illogical. In other words, what Mackie tries to say here is that the believers may resort to the arguments that omnipotence does not extend to doing logically impossible things. It's like, yeah, God is absolutely good, and there is evil in the world, but we're like saying, yes, God simply just allow that, and it has nothing to do with the existence of God. As Saint Thomas Aquinas argues, God can do all things that are possible. So, maybe as an absolutely good God, as an all-powerful God, omnipotent, he just allowed that to happen. And so there seems to be, and God can do that, And so there seems to be no contradiction here. But for Mackie, no, it's an illogical impossibility. In response to this, Mackie uses the analogy of size, big and small, for example. He asks, does greatness require smallness? Of course, you can anticipate Mackie's argument here. It's like saying, as what I have mentioned in passing a while ago, that we tend to argue that darkness is necessary for us to appreciate light. It's like saying suffering is, or challenges or difficulties are necessary for some kind of personal developments, that it makes us stronger. The very basic arguments in personality theory. But for Mackie, again, that is an illogical impossibility. That is impossible. And so again, Mackie asks, does greatness require smallness? So he uses this analogy to prove the untenability of the claim that evil is necessary for the existence of good. Mackie then concludes that good things are only relatively good, even that God is only relatively good. Hence, it would appear that God is trying to maximize relative goodness. But if one thinks of God trying to make everything in the universe relatively bigger, one realizes that this does not make much sense. In fact, Mackie argues that this does not work if one imagines something to be absolutely good or big. This is because, as Mackie would have us believe, an absolutely big thing like the universe does not require smaller things to exist in order for it to be called big. So the bigness of a stone, for example, or the bigness of a tree, or the bigness of the building, or the bigness of the universe, the existence of that something, does not necessarily depend on the existence of something small. Okay? But not the other way around. And so therefore, the arguments that evil is necessary for something good to exist, again and again and again, is a logical form for Mackie. So he said the same would be true of an absolutely good thing. We cannot use that arguments. Indeed, for Mackie, the arguments that goodness requires evil as a counterpart does not hold water. It's illogical. It's faulty. It's irrational. And so we see Mackie destroyed the first solution, the first argument to the existence of God. And this is again the first solution under fallacious solution. Let me proceed to the second argument. The second solution reads, evil is necessary as a means to good. We also, believers also use these arguments. Okay? Or if they're not using consciously these arguments, but this argument, this statement is inherent in any arguments for the existence of God, in any arguments for proving that God is good despite the existence of evil. So we have the claim that, yeah, evil is necessary as a means to good. The basic idea here is that God uses evil to bring about goodness. It's quite similar to the first, of course, but let me just emphasize this one. In other words, evil, according to Mackie, evil is a means to an end. A classical example is the arguments that suffering, such as becoming broke or losing a loved one, is a necessary part for personal development. It's mentioned that a while ago, because again, the second solution is quite, related to the first one. So if so, the argument is evil is a necessary means to something good. Concrete example that Mackie uses here is again, suffering is an integral part of a meaningful life in the future, of personal development. Suffering is integral, is part of a process to becoming strong or stronger individuals. And so therefore pain in this argument is necessary. So all types of evil are necessary because the argument is they are considered means to goodness. This kind of evil will produce something good at the end of the day. It's a very common example as well for our arguments for God's existence, and as a way of justifying evil things in the society despite the existence of a good God. So we don't blame God for the injustices in the world, for wars, for hunger and debaucheries and all stuff for that matter. We don't blame God, according to Mackie, of course, because at the end of the day, we have the tendency to justify these things, these happenings, this suffering, these evil things as a means again to goodness. For Mackie, this argument implies a restriction on God's omnipotence. A restriction, it puts a limit, in other words, to God's power. If it is a law of cause and effects that evil has to cause goodness, then according to Mackie, omnipotence ought to be able to break this law. If we claim that this is the law, the cause and effect relationship, evil will lead to something good, but the argument of Mackie, and maybe you agree with Mackie, that look, an all-powerful being can block that one, can break that law, can not allow evil to exist. Most believers think that God created the laws of causality in the first place, and miracles are supposed to show God breaking causal laws. And so these miracles, for example, if God is a creator, and then we have witnessed miracles, for example, and that shows that, of course, God can break that law. In other words, God can, spare us from all these types of suffering, from these injustices, forms of violence, and things like that. God can do that in just, split of a second, the blink of an eye. As a powerful being, he can do that. But he did not. Mackie writes, in its simple form, this has little plausibility as a solution to the problem of evil. since it obviously implies a severe restriction of God's power. It would be a causal law that you cannot have a certain end without a certain means. So that if God has to introduce evil as a means to good, he must be subject to at least some causal laws. Therefore, he is, if that's the case, then God is not omnipotent. He is not all powerful. And so therefore, the second solution is also illogical, is also irrational. And then Mackie proceeds with the third solution. Of course, again, this solution is not Mackie's solution. For Mackie, this is, this solution are the solutions offered by the believers. Those who provide or provide some proofs to God's existence. And so again, in his paper, Mackie simply tried to discredit or to debunk those arguments and show that those arguments again and again and again are illogical or irrational. The third solution reads, the universe is better with some evil in it than it could be if there were no evil. It's quite similar again, related to the second one. It's like, that suffering is important for some kind of personal developments. Also, we're better off, or the universe is better with some, evil. Life is better with some evil. A person who is successful in life through overcoming difficult challenges, has attained some kind of a meaningful success, meaningful life. The basic idea here is that certain kinds of evil are necessary for certain kinds of good. Mackie uses the analogy of pain and disease to drive his point. Indeed, according to Mackie, without disease and pain, it would be impossible to have medical advances and feelings of sympathy for the sick. So it's quite similar to the first arguments. But here, the argument is, it's society, the universe, life is better with some kind of evil in it. Like, without pain and suffering, then we could not have, advances in medical technologies or discoveries. And as Mackie shows, that seems to be the positions of the believers. They always try to justify the existence of this evil. And Mackie is playing the devil's advocate. No, it doesn't hold water. Maybe you're just having an illusion. Mackie mentions the analogy used by Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, of course, of an artist who includes ugly features in his work, such as discordant notes and dark colors, for an overall pleasing effect. Even in arts, for example. So there is a conglomeration, or there is a constellation of evil things, of dark colors, of debaucheries, of suffering, to make the art have some kind of overall pleasing effect. Well, sometimes it might not. Sometimes if there is just one color out there, and it's not a beautiful art. I do not know if that analogy works, but for Mackie, it doesn't hold water. It's still illogical. It's weak arguments. Mackie then makes an important distinction between first and second order goods and evils. He writes, evil is pain and good is happiness. But good involves compassion and courage, which are only possible in a world with evil in it. That's the argument. Mackie then explains the fatal objection to this. There must also be evil, such as cruelty. In other words, if the argument is that we are better off with some kind of evil than no evil at all, because a piece of art, for example, cannot have an overall pleasing effect if there is no discordance and dark colors and things like that. Then Mackie is saying, and so therefore, cruelty is necessary, injustices are necessary, forms of violence are necessary. And so if that's the case, Mackie would have us believe, as Mackie would have us believe, Mackie would have argued, why complain about cruelty? Why complain about inequality? If you argue that indeed the universe, the society, life is better with some kind of evil than no evil at all. If the theist argues that there is good, which is increasing the amount of goods in the world, then there is also evil, which is increasing the amount of evil. And this leads to an infinite regress. So again, solution number 3 does not hold water. For Mackie, the solution is also illogical. And then then Mackie proceeds to the 4th solutions that believers offered. And the solution reads, evil is due to human free will. And this is, I'm sure everyone can relate with this. This is a very common argument for the believers, especially in Augustinian theology. St. Augustine's arguments, look, when God created man or the human person, God gives the human person freedom or free will. And after that, it seems like, it's like God is saying, you're now on your own. And because of freedom or free will, we as human beings commit sins. And so therefore, it's not God that is to blame or who is to blame for the existence of evil, but it's the free will or the freedom of human beings. Yeah, maybe. But before I proceed with Mackie's argument for, or response to this solution, we can also think of a hypothetical syllogism in logic to show that indeed this argument is not logical. If you have taken symbolic logic, for example, if you're familiar with hypothetical syllogisms in symbolic logic, we have 3 propositions there. P then Q, Q then R, therefore P then R. In other words, the proposition or the hypothetical syllogism reads, if P is the cause of Q and Q is the cause of R, then P is, diagonally speaking, is the cause of R. And we know that in mathematics or in research as a whole, a variable is anything that can be replaced by any value at any time. And so if we replace PQR with God evil, God freedom or free will and evil, then the proposition reads, if God, hypothetical proposition, if God is the cause of free will in this world and free will is the cause of evil in this world, then obviously at the end of the day, reason tells us, diagonally speaking, that God is the cause of evil at the end of the day. That doesn't hold water again. But this is the argument of Mackie. The idea here is that many kinds of evil are not the result of God's actions, but of the free actions of human beings. And so we tend not to blame God for everything that happens in this world, because He had given us freedom and we have or free will, and we have now the power to choose between right and wrong, good and evil. But seemingly the argument of Mackie is, look, God could not have given us freedom, or God could have created us as perfect being, so that we do not need to choose between good and evil, so that we will do good all the time. But let me continue. Mackie asks, how can this count as a solution to the problem of evil, given that God created the free-willed creatures? It's God who created them, these free will creatures. by way of hypothetical syllogism. If there is a cause, then it points to the ultimate, if there is an effect, then it points to the ultimate cause. P then Q, Q then R, therefore P then R. It's impossible to drop P from the equation because it's the ultimate cause. The theist's reply has to be something like this, according to Mackie. Okay? Free will is a great good. Creatures that lack free will are automata. Automaton, automata, the plural thing. And a world of automata would be worse than a world with evil in it. Second, it is impossible, even for God, to create a being which has free will and to ensure that it never brings about evil. Okay? In other words, second argument is, well, God created beings with freedom or free will, but it's impossible, for God to create that being with free will without committing some kind of evil, because that's tied to existence of evil or the commission of evil acts, stealing, cheating, and things like that are tied to the idea of free will. It's a limitation, in a sense, in our parts. So it's better that God made us with free will and not as robots or automata who are kind or brave in a machine-like way. An all-powerful, good God would make a world in which human beings have free will, rather than we're just automated like robots. We follow without, our own volition, our own will, and can choose kindness over cruelty. We have this free will. We can choose kindness over cruelty. We can choose justice over injustice. Mackie's main objection is to question why God didn't create us so that we always choose good over evil of our own free will. So this is the classic argument, of course. So we do not need to read Mackie in order to think of the idea to come up with the idea that God could have created perfect beings so that we don't need to choose between good and evil. God could have created perfect beings who will always choose the good and not evil. In other words, Mackie is saying, why would you, as a powerful God, as a good God, create some choices, for human beings to choose? Where in fact, you can just create a being that would always do good. Why couldn't we have been created morally stronger beings? Is some kind of lament in the case of recur, but the idea is it's kind of complaint from Mackie's end. Why couldn't you, God, created morally stronger beings? Why did you create weak beings and suffer debaucheries and suffering and pain and all stuff for that matter? It's possible to be free-willed, according to Mackie, and yet always choose good actions instead of evil ones, Mackie writes. What Mackie is trying to say here is, it is possible to be free-willed. In other words, it's possible for God to give us free will so that we will not look like robots or automatons, beings that simply follow orders without questioning, without invoking or accessing some freedom or free will within us. That's possible for God. Mackie writes, God was not then faced with a choice between making innocent automata and making beings who, in acting freely, would sometimes go wrong. There was open to him the obviously better possibility of making beings who would act freely but always go right. That's possible according to Mackie. I agree with Mackie. If God could have created beings with free will, and yet they're always inclined to do good, to choose right. Clearly, according to Mackie, his failure to avail himself of this possibility is inconsistent with his being both omnipotent and wholly good. So please take notes. This is a caveat at this point. Mackie is not saying there is no God. Again, please be guided by the main intention of that I mentioned a while ago, or the main intention of the paper, that Mackie's main intention in the paper is just to show that those arguments do not hold water, that those arguments are irrational, are illogical. Mackie is not saying there's no God. No, that's not, that's, you might be tempted to think that way, but that's beside the point. As we can see, the concluding parts. Now, as we can see, before the concluding part, of course, as we can see, when theists or believers say that making wrong choices is necessary for freedom, Mackie accuses them of confusing free will with randomness. Mackie thinks free will involves acting in accordance with our character. We only blame a person if we think their actions come from bad character. If free actions were random, we would have no reason to condemn people. But if free will is based on character, it does not solve the problem of evil because God creates us with our characters. So he is ultimately responsible for our choices. Remember, P then Q, Q then R, therefore P then R. If God is the cause of free will in this world, if God is the source of free will because God gives us free will, and free will is the cause of evil in this world, so at the end of the day, Mackie is trying to say that it's God who is responsible for evil things in the world. That might not appeal, that might not appeal to you, but please don't get scandalized with that. We're not saying there is no God. Mackie is not saying there's no God. Mackie is just saying that argument does not hold water. Mackie concludes that the free will defense, the fourth solution, only works if you assume God is omnipotent. He explains the paradox of omnipotence with the idea of God creating something he can't control. That is, first, if God can create truly free creatures, there is a limit to his power. He is therefore not omnipotent because he could not create that being with free will, but will choose the right thing all the time. And second, if God can create truly free creatures, there is something he can't control, and therefore a limit to his power. I hope you see the argument of Mackie here. If God can create truly free creatures, a free being who always chooses the good, the right thing, but that will put a limit as well to God's omnipotence, because we witness evil in the world that will discount that fact, that existence of suffering and limitations and blindness, physical limitations, blindness, for example, and all types of suffering is contradictory to the claim that God is omnipotent, who can do anything he wants to do. Either way, omnipotence is impossible. The idea of all-powerful being is impossible, given the argument, of course, forwarded by. Please take note again that the idea here that omnipotence is impossible, Mackie again and again and again is just attacking the arguments of the believers, of the theists. Mackie is not attacking God. Take note. It's just that the arguments offered by the believers are irrational. Now let me now proceed to the concluding parts of this synthesis, the video lecture on Mackie's famous work, Evil and Omnipotence. It must be noted that Mackie did not offer any solution to the problem of evil and omnipotence. So students always have a tendency, to look for some solutions and some alternatives. Students are always tempted to think, so how did Mackie solve the problem? So what will be, if all of these arguments are illogical, and so what then is Mackie's arguments? That's not the case here, because again, as I have mentioned over and over and over again, the main intention of Mackie's paper is just to show that the arguments offered by believers as to the existence of God are irrational, nothing less, nothing more. Okay, so it must be noted that Mackie did not offer any solution to the problem of evil and omnipotence. What Mackie did is simply examine the solutions theists or believers offers to the problem of evil and omnipotence. Let me end this video lecture, by reading Mackie's conclusion. And I quote, of the proposed solutions of the problem of evil which we have examined in the above discussion, none has stood up to criticism. Every argument for the existence of God, in other words, is fallacious. There may be other solutions which require examination, but this study, or his paper, Mackie's paper, Evil and Omnipotence, strongly suggests that there is no valid solution of the problem which does not modify at least one of the constituent propositions in a way which would seriously affect the essential core of the theistic position. As we know, Mackie introduced the idea of, well, the adequate arguments. Now we can easily drop one statement, one proposition from the equation. Again, God is good, God is omnipotent, yet evil exists. If we just deny the existence of evil, then we can easily solve the problem of evil and omnipotence. But that is a position that believers, the theists, are not willing to adopt, are not willing to buy. Let me continue. Quite apart from the problem of evil, the paradox of omnipotence has shown that God's omnipotence must in any case be restricted in one way or another. That unqualified omnipotence cannot be ascribed to any being that continues through time. And if God and his actions are not in time, Mackie closes his paper with a question in relation to the first sentence, question of time. Mackie asks, and if God and his actions are not in time, can omnipotence or power of any sort be meaningfully ascribed to him? Of course, we can speculate about the question, but Mackie left his readers figuring out or speculating about the question. Mackie didn't further explain or provide any explanations to that question. And so much for the synthesis on Mackie's work on evil and omnipotence. And I hope that you were able to follow the discussion here. So thank you very much and have a good day, everyone, again.